This is a 1993 Toyota Corolla, and I will be doing a passenger side axle on it. Now I know there's a lift, and I know I'm using air tools, but I'm just basically trying to show you the basic idea of how to do an axle on a car like this. And most front-wheel drive cars are the same, and even some rear-wheel drive cars. So here I am, of course, taking off the wheel. Of course, you probably use a breaker bar or a T-screw or something like that to remove the wheels. So the first thing I'm doing here is I'm removing the cotter pin. It's a pin that is holding the axle nut in place. It's really just there for safety, just in case the axle nut comes off, or if it loosens or something. It's just so it doesn't fall off the actual axle and the axle stays in place. So I'm having a little trouble here removing it. Probably going to use some better pliers to try to remove this. See if my friend Daniel will pass me in. There we go. Let's give it a good yank. You could probably use vice grips and a hammer, or sometimes you just take your time and straighten out the cotter pin and it'll come out pretty easily on your little WD-40, and there it goes. There's always like a little cap on top of the nut itself. You take that off, and then depending on the axle nut size, in this case it's a 30 millimeter. Like I said, yes, I am using an air tool to remove this. But what you can do is if you have the other tire on the ground, and you have the car in park or in gear, the pressure from the transmission and from the other wheel will not let that axle spin, and with a large breaker bar you could remove it fairly easily. Now, I didn't have a punch to remove this axle easily, so what I'm doing right now is I'm putting the axle nut back on the axle, and I'm going to hit it with a hammer. You don't want to hit it without something on there, because you could do what's called mushrooming the threads, making them a little wider, and that could damage the axle in case you're trying to reuse it. So if you put the nut on there, like I'm pointing out, you can hit it as hard as you want, and I won't mushroom out. And that one was pretty easy. Sometimes they're really hard to remove, and you have to really hit them and put some WD-40 penetrating oil, but this one was relatively easy. Now, most cars, you have to loosen up the suspension a little bit to remove the axle. Usually all you need to do is remove the ball joint from the bottom, just loosen it up. In this case, there are three 17 millimeter, two bolts and one nut holding down the ball joint at the bottom to the lower control arm. Sometimes you need to remove the nut from the ball joint itself, and you have to hit it and loosen it up and then use a pry bar. But in this case, it's just three fasteners, and I'm going to use a pry bar to separate them since I already loosened them. Oh, and here's a defect on the axle, by the way. It's just the boot has split, and this is why I'm replacing it. And you don't want that, because all the grease flings out, and then your axle no longer has any lubrication, and it's bound to start clicking and may eventually break. So here I am separating the lower control arm from the knuckle, and it will allow me much more freedom of movement to remove this axle. So, as you can see here, all you gotta do is pull them apart, and it's that easy. It literally just, once you have it loose like that, once you hit it with the hammer, it comes off really easy. Now the next job is to remove the axle from the transmission. If you have a manual transmission, it's a good idea to have a pan underneath it to catch the manual transmission fluid, which would be pouring out, and some automatics too, so it's probably a good idea to have a pan. I know for a fact in this case it won't be pouring out. Now the way I'm doing it is I'm hitting it from on the axle itself, on the actual metal casing, which you can see right here. I just hit it with the hammer and a pry bar, and it's literally that easy to come out. Sometimes you have to pry it with a large pry bar, but in this case it wasn't necessary. So here I'm lubricating the new axle, so when it goes in fairly smoothly. As you can see, there is a hog ring type pin there. That's what actually holds it in the transmission. You got to make sure that snaps in when you're putting in the new axle, right in there where the axle seal is.
You don't look at the seal.
So here I am lining it up. As you can see, you just slide it in, no pun intended, and once you have it in, it's a good idea to try to spin the axle. This way you can get the splines to line up. And a good way to know if your splines lined up is if there's resistance to spinning, and if you go to the other wheel and start spinning it, the axle should spin as well. So I'm going to be doing that in just a moment. So I'm going to spin the other wheel. Oh, maybe I will.
I'm going to hit it right there. Make sure it's actually
on there, right? Spin the other wheel and see the axle spinning. That means that it's splined in. Now all it has to do is just get pushed in. So I'm going to use my pry bar and a hammer again. This axle is actually really nice. They actually put these notches in there where you can put a pry bar.
Maybe turn it to where you can hit it better.
So you can hit it with a hammer, and that's what I'm doing. It'll take me a few tries, but it will go in. You just have to keep trying. Sometimes you don't have those notches, and what you'll have to do is you'll have to go to the outside of the axle and just kind of push it in. Just got to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. It's always easier if you have it lined up already. You should have it as perpendicular to the face of the transmission as possible, and that always helps get the axle in. In this case, since I have the notches, all I really have to do is just kind of keep hitting it. So there, it's in. I'm just making sure that it's all the way in. And moving the new axle nut off the new axle. Well, it's actually a remanufactured axle. So then you just slide it in two. You have to make sure that the splices line up so you don't have to spin the rotor a little bit. That one was pretty easy. I put the new nut on the end of it just so it won't slide out while I'm moving the control arm and the knuckle. And there's usually a washer that goes underneath the nut too. Make sure to always put that, because sometimes it just acts like a spacer too, and it may be necessary to make sure your axle's on tight. So in this case, I'm just lowering the control arm and then sliding the two studs to the holes.
This is an easy one.
Yeah, it was.
Put the fasteners back on. Again, you want to look up your specs. They usually, this, as long as it's tight, it's usually good enough, but it might be a good idea to look up the specs and torque it properly. In this case, I'm just using the gun, making sure that they're tight. Again, I know you guys are probably using hand tools, but I'm just showing you the basic idea of how to do this.
Yes.
So now I'm going to be putting back the axle nut. Again, I'm using an air gun. Like I said before, just like loosening, to tighten, you can have the other wheel on the ground, or you can even have a friend inside of the car pushing the brake, holding the brake, and you'll be able to tighten it that way too. Always use a new cotter pin when you're placing an axle. It's always a good idea. It's a safety thing. You know, a bent cotter pin that's been bent several times is weakened and has a tendency to break. So if you have a new one, it's just better. They're cheap. They're pennies. You can buy a pack of it for $5, and you'll have as many cotter pins as you need for the rest of your life.
Time lapse? Yeah.
So that's pretty much done. The axle is done. All we need to do is put the wheel on, and in this case I'm using a little brake clean because I have a lot of grease on my hands, obviously, from doing this job, and the rotors need to be cleaned. Get the grease off, and
start putting tape
this way we won't have any problems while braking. So if any of you guys out there that are using a lift, it's probably a good idea to lift the tires with your knees, never with your back. Always crouch all the way down and picking up a wheel. And this is a Toyota Corolla, and yes, I know it has Honda hubcaps. This is how I got the car. It's not a Honda, I swear. But it does have Honda hubcaps. It's kind of a mutt, this car. I believe it has a Nissan fuel cap as well. So we're very diverse here. I believe the torque spec for these wheels are 110 foot-pounds. Like I said, it's always a good idea to torque everything. Here I'm just using a gun to just tighten them up. And that's it. You are done with your axle.
19?
It's that easy. Some of them are more difficult simply because they're tighter in there and they might be harder to hammer out. But